Today we continue our dive into UFO lore, including the Roswell Incident and other close encounters which took place in the 1940s and 50s. This video is the second part of the series, so in case you missed the first episode, in it we covered the history of UFOs from ancient past up to the mid-20th century. It was a fun ride and you may want to check out that first. Otherwise, stay here with us, fasten your spacesuits, and let's go make friends with some little green men. In 1939, Europe was plunged into absolute chaos with the start of World War II. Soon afterwards, the United States joined the conflict following the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941. We mention this because throughout the war, many military pilots, particularly British, reported seeing shiny spheres flying around them. Luckily for those pilots, the UFOs never attacked. They simply accompanied the aircraft for a while and then vanished like a fart in a gale. These phenomena were soon nicknamed Foo Fighters, and the Allies thought they might be some sort of Nazi secret weapon. Ironically enough, the Nazis also viewed these reports as evidence of a secret weapon, but a British one. The most commonly accepted theory is that those pilots witnessed ball lightning, a rare phenomenon associated to electrical storms which is not well understood to this day. Another explanation is that it may have been an optical effect similar to St. Elmo's fire, or perhaps light reflecting from ice crystals, or enemy spy probes seen from the distance, or the shiny souls of golden retrievers ascending to puppy heaven. The point is, nobody really knows for sure. Another interesting rumor circulating at the time was the one about gremlins, evil creatures that sabotage aircrafts and other machinery. This story became very popular in the RAF to the point that children's author Roald Dahl, himself a fighter pilot, turned into a book, which later Walt Disney planned to turn into a film. Although the project was cancelled, the idea remained and was later used in the TV series The Twilight Zone, the Gremlins film saga, and several other examples. But let's stay with the Nazis for now, because that lot indulged in several mad theories related to UFOs and extraterrestrials. As you probably know, many of the Nazi top brass were completely obsessed with esoteric business, and formed secret organizations like the Thule Society and the Vril Society, which exalted Aryan superiority and that kind of rubbish. Can't stand intolerant people. Among such societies, it's worth highlighting the Ahnenerbe, a pseudo-scientific, educational and archaeological organization which sought to investigate these types of subjects. It was this same Ahnenerbe that financed Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Schaeffer's 1938 expedition to the Tibetan Himalayas, in search of the origins of the Germanic race and the last remains of the Shambhala, as we mentioned in our video on Atlantis. In fact, some of these people were convinced that the predecessors had come from another planet, or from a superior race which ruled the world in ancient times.
Madness, mass hysteria, delusion.
In addition, they also explored the Antarctic in 1938, specifically the region of Queen Maud's Land. With what purpose, I hear you ask? Well, conspiracy theorists believe that they were attempting to build a secret base for UFOs, but it's far more likely that they were seeking a location for a whaling station in order to increase the whale oil production, which was still used as a fuel at the time. Now, moving forward to the end of the war, in 1947, the US conducted Operation High Jump, which involved military training maneuvers near Antarctica. The rumors say that the real objective was to destroy the last remaining strongholds of the Nazi UFOs in the frozen continent. But wait a minute, did the Nazis actually have the necessary technology to create UFOs? Well, no, not really. But they certainly made huge technological leaps with jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me 262 and also with the rockets like the legendary V-2 ballistic missile. And we must also mention the Horten HO-229, a prototype developed by the Horten brothers, which was the first yet propelled flying wing. Remember that name, because it will come up later again. Perhaps the coolest myth of all is the Bell, or Die Glocke, a supposed top-secret Nazi device featuring an anti-gravity engine that allowed it to fly around like a typical UFO. Unfortunately for those conspiracy theorists, it seems that it was all just a pipe dream, concocted by Polish author Igor Wikowski. For their part, the Americans also played around with a few experimental aircrafts, like this disc-shaped one called Vought V173, also known as the Flying Pancake, and its successor, the Vought XF5U, the Flying Flapjack. And although they had a very limited run, it is believed that the flight test may have originated many UFO eyewitness reports. After the war, the Soviets and the Americans captured many Nazi scientists in what was known as Operation Paperclip. The main name here is Werner von Braun, the German engineer responsible for the V-2 who collaborated in the Apollo project to send the first manned mission to the moon. By the 1940s, science fiction was all the rage. Not so much in cinema, but certainly in radio, literature, and pulp magazines like Amazing Stories. In 1945, this publication, edited by Raymond Palmer, included a story by a certain Richard Schaefer entitled I Remember Lemuria. It featured a powerful prehistoric civilization which built highly advanced cities in deep caverns and spoke a proto-human language called Man tongue. Now, these lot had trouble with the solar radiation bathing the Earth, so they abandoned the planet, leaving behind the descendants, the Terros, who then degenerated into sadistic creatures called Deros, who in turn kidnapped humans to torture and eat them, and also used mysterious beams to cause nightmares and schizophrenia. According to Schaefer's fiction, the Deros still abduct people occasionally, in the underground or sewer system, which is why you shouldn't organize picnics there. The story was very successful and launched Amazing Stories. Another important magazine at the time was Weird Tales, focused primarily on fantasy and terror, and which is famous for publishing H.P. Lovecraft's first stories. This American author was mostly unknown by the time he died in 1937, but afterwards his friends and a small group of followers, many whom were also writers, founded the publisher Arkham House and published his works throughout the 1940s. This was the beginning of the cosmic horror literature, a new subgenre which moved away from ghost stories and satanic rituals to include elements connected to ancient races, monsters, and other dimensions. Many of these stories were part of the Cthulhu mythos, named after the famous alien monster Cthulhu, or Cthulhu, or Thulu, or however the heck you pronounce that name. Returning to UFOs, in 1945 we also have the incident of Flight 19, when 5 American bomber planes mysteriously disappeared near the coast of Florida. There was some radio interference, apparently the compass went crazy, and then puff, they disappeared and were never seen again. To make matters worse, a Mariner flying boat which was sent as a search and rescue operation blew up mid-air, leaving no survivors. This was the origin of the Bermuda Triangle myth. Some said that underneath the maritime area there was an alien base which shot down any planes or sunk any ships that came too close, but in reality it isn't much of a mystery, considering that the area has some of the densest sea and air traffic in the world. Accidents are statistically bound to happen. Specifically, the incident of Flight 19 could be explained as a human error by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, who may have lost his heading and realized his mistake too late, causing the aircraft to run out of fuel somewhere over the Atlantic. This type of unexplained aviation incidents were relatively common back then, since they didn't have any advanced radar technology as we do nowadays.
Yes, I love technology.
On the 24th of June of 1947, we have what is considered as the first modern sighting of an unidentified flying object. We're talking about the case of Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot who, while flying over Mount Rainier in the US state of Washington, reported seeing 9 strange objects crossing the sky. Arnold estimated their speed at around 2,000 kilometers per hour and described them as kitchen plates, which led to the famous idea of the flying saucers. But let me ask you something. That shape, kind of like a boomerang, doesn't it remind you of something? Remember the horse and flying wing we talked about earlier? Just saying. And talking about flying saucers, we should make it clear that Arnold never actually described them as such. What he said was that they were shaped as a half moon and they moved like saucers skipping over water. This statement was misreported by a journalist named Bill Beckett, and what a coincidence. From that point onwards, the majority of UFOs sighted were shaped as flying saucers. Hey, but who knows? Perhaps the aliens decided to redesign the spaceships to fit the reporter's mistake. After this, Kenneth Arnold became relatively famous and took part in several investigations to confirm the veracity of different eyewitness accounts from people who swore that had also seen or been in contact with UFOs. Raymond Palmer published the story in Amazing Stories and even sent Arnold as a reporter to the Maury Islands south of Seattle, where 2 harbor patrolmen said that they had seen 6 donut-shaped UFOs which had dropped some metal fragments next to them. Arnold interviewed 2 military officers from the US Air Force who had examined the metallic objects. They reported that they were just pieces of aluminium and that it all seemed like a hoax. The thing is that a few days later, those 2 same officers, Frank Brown and William Davidson, died when their return flight to California crashed.
What a coincidence!
Nevertheless, the FBI concluded that the whole thing had been a setup by a private company in Tacoma, aimed at scaring people who owned vacation homes in the region so they could hire their services. In addition, one of the 2 patrolmen, Harold Dahl, said that he received a visit from a strange man in a dark suit telling him to forget all about the affair. This in turn popularized the idea of the Men in Black, supposed secret government agents whose mission is to cover any incident related to UFOs and aliens.
You know what the difference is between you and me? I make this look good.
In the following weeks, reports of UFO sightings all over the USA began to flood in, possibly due to collective hysteria as well as pranksters and people who wanted to make money with the fad. Among these, we can mention the Twin Falls flying saucer hoax, which took place in Idaho. In this case, some locals said that they had retrieved a small flying saucer about 2.5 feet in diameter. That's 75 centimeters for the rest of the world. But when the FBI turned up to investigate the case, a group of teenagers confessed that they had made it all up. Naughty, naughty. And with this, we reach the super famous Roswell Incident, which took place on the 2nd of July 1947, barely 1 month after Kenneth Arnold saw his UFO. The story goes that on that day, a UFO crashed at a ranch in New Mexico. The owner, a farmer named William McBrazel, witnessed the explosion and then discovered signs of metallic wreckage near the site. He called the sheriff, who in return notified the army, and then next thing you know, the entire area was cordoned off. As expected, the local newspapers had a field day with this, particularly the Roswell Daily Record, which said that a flying saucer had been captured, and the news spread like wildfire. It was even reported that the authorities had retrieved the bodies of 3 humanoid creatures. According to the official version, Brazel's description were consistent with scientific balloons used in the US at the time, mainly to study the weather, but also to spy on the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that this was at the time of the Cold War. In the 1990s, when some secret material was declassified, some investigations said that the incident was connected to the 4th flight of Project Mogul, a top-secret project which sought to use high-altitude balloons to gather information about the Soviet Union and the nuclear weapons test. This idea does make sense, given that Roswell was right in the middle of several testing areas. At White Sands, they experimented with German V-2 missiles. Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project was conducted at the premises of Los Alamos, and the desert of Alamogordo witnessed the first nuclear explosion in history at the Trinity site on July 1945. Incidentally, some theories say that the same first nuclear explosion was the signal that alerted nearby aliens of humanity's development, and that ever since then they have been spying on us, keeping an eye on our technological progress and construction of future weapons. Rumor has it that they are subscribed to this channel, so perhaps you want to leave them a message in the comment section. Anyway, back to Roswell. Logically, the US government had more than enough reasons to raise a smokescreen in this case. First, they tried to stop all the publications about the affair, but when they realized people were saying that this was clearly some alien business, they decided to let the story spread, and perhaps even promote them covertly, as this was the best outcome for them. They would rather have public attention distracted with conspiracy theories and flying saucers than discussing the truth, military devices to spy on Russia. And so, the Roswell Incident became a big legend in the world of ufology. Most of the common archetypes and themes about the subject originated here. You name it. The government hiding extraterrestrial technology, Men in Black, the development of ultra-advanced weapons, the X-Files, the truth is out there, and a long, long list. That is how Roswell grew into the spiritual capital of the UFO lore, with museums, themed bars, merchandising, and anything you can imagine.
These people need love.
Later in 1995, a video recording appeared which supposedly showed the autopsy of one of the aliens who died in Roswell. I was a small boy at the time, but I remember being totally dumbstruck when this was mentioned in the news. Disappointingly, it was eventually discovered to be a hoax orchestrated by an Englishman named Ray Santilli. This smartass created the clip and then sold it to various TV outlets around the world for a lot of money, but eventually he admitted the fraud in 2006.
Illegal alien autopsy.
As the kerfuffle concerning UFOs reached fever pitch, the US government realized that it was time to get a grip on things. What they did was create the Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, where they run multiple projects and investigate UFO cases all over the country following a well-established protocol. The first of these was Project Sign in 1947. This was a little bit like the X-Files, a joint group of military men and scientists who investigated a total of 273 UFO reports seeking any signs of extraterrestrial activity, and concluded that they all had some perfectly rational explanation. Nevertheless, a small group of this commission did believe that some UFOs could be due to spaceships from other worlds. The first was the Mantell UFO incident, when a young captain named Thomas Mantell chased a UFO with his plane. Unfortunately, he ended up crashing and dying in that pursuit. The second was the Gorman Dogfight, in which pilot George Gorman saw a Foo Fighter overflying Fargo. And the third was the Chiles-Whitted UFO encounter, when 2 commercial pilots saw a shiny object as they flew over Alabama. According to the group's investigation, the first 2 cases were actually sightseeings of skyhook balloons, while the third was a meteorite. By the way, the committee which allegedly investigated all of this was known as Majestic 12, since it was comprised by 12 government high-ups. At the time, there was some concern that all these UFO reports were actually planes from the Soviet Union, similar to the ones developed by the Horton brothers. In 1948, Project Sign became Project Grudge, and its purpose shifted towards investigating UFO phenomena, but under the premise that they were not extraterrestrial flying sources. Lastly, perhaps the most famous of these initiatives was Project Blue Book, established in 1952 by Charles P. Cabell and headed by the US Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt. And the idea was to determine whether or not UFO represented a danger for national security. An astronomer named Josef Allen Hynek was the consultant for the project and one of its notable members. In fact, there is even a TV series about Project Blue Book, and he is the main protagonist, interpreted by Aileen Gillen, or Littlefinger from Game of Thrones. After gathering more than 12,000 reports, in 1969, the project concluded that the vast majority of UFO incidents were either misinterpretations of natural phenomena or aircraft sightings. Many others were considered frauds, and just around 6% were labeled unexplained.
I still think it's pretty fishy, Batman.
Incidentally, it was Captain Ruppelt who decided to rename flying saucers as UFOs, unidentified flying objects. He published a book in 1956 which recounted his experience studying UFOs, and basically concluded that none of them were alien spaceships. As an interesting point, there are also less well-known marine phenomena called USOs, unidentified submerged objects, but that's a story for another episode. Meanwhile, Hynek the astronomer developed the concept of close encounters. He described 3 kinds of encounters with presences from another world. Encounters of the first kind including the visual sightings of unidentified flying objects in the sky. Encounters on the second kind would require some physical evidence of a UFO, including interference with machinery, impressions on the ground, and that kind of thing. And the third kind would be an encounter with a UFO in which an animated entity was present. Later, some additional types were added, including the fourth, which were simple abductions. The fifth would be telepathic contact. The sixth, when a UFO or alien caused the death of a human or an animal. The seventh would involve the creation of an alien hybrid. The eighth include permanent contact with an alien entity, and finally the ninth would be a complete abduction, in which the victim is tortured and eventually killed.
That's a terrible ending.
In 1949, True magazine published an article written by Donald Kehoe, a former aviator in the US Marine Corps, who said that UFOs were 100% real. Evidently, this caused a great commotion. And then to make matters worse, the following year Kehoe wrote the book with the unimaginative title of The Flying Saucers Are Real, which sold more than 500,000 copies. A little later, in July 1952, there were several UFO sightings near Washington DC's National Airport on 2 consecutive weekends. At the time, they were explained as a natural phenomenon of temperature inversion, but this didn't convince anyone and lots of people panicked. Partly in response to the public mood, the CIA created the Robertson Panel, comprised by scientists, physicists, meteorologists, engineers, and astronomers, and headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, a physicist from Caltech. The committee spent a long time reviewing all the documentation from Project Blue Book, and concluded that the entire UFO business was a bunch of malarkey. Its recommendation to the Air Force was to play down this business, and perhaps even conduct discrediting and ridicule campaigns in the media in order to stifle the public interest. In addition, they also advised keeping an eye on groups of conspiracy nuts, as they did have a big influence in many credulous souls. Several strange cases were explained as fault fractures, oil and gas prospecting, and the release of ethylene and other gases, since tectonic movements often cause light effects in the sky. In addition, many of those gases tend to cause hallucinations. In fact, ethylene is thought to be the very same gas that the soothsayers in the Oracle of Delphi used to enter trances and view the future. Or, just to get high, depending on your perspective.
What are you implying?
Not implying, stating.
The thing is that, following the committee's recommendation, the leadership of Project Blue Book shifted its main focus, from serious UFO investigations to our PR activities aimed at discrediting the whole issue. Frustrated by this change of direction, Captain Ruppelt left in 1953, but Hynek the astronomer stayed until the end. In the initial years of the research, Hynek had been skeptical and argued that most UFO reports had a perfectly rational explanation. However, although he had never seen a flying object himself, he gradually opened up his mind, and after many years of investigative work, reached the conclusion that there were some genuinely unexplainable cases. Hynek always advocated for a rigorous scientific approach to investigating these phenomena, and although he never totally ruled out the extraterrestrial origin hypothesis, he didn't promote it openly either. Because of his extremely rigorous approach, when the project took a new direction, Hynek began to experience considerable friction with the military heads. He disagreed with their methods and conclusions, and they in turn blocked his proposals, since they were most interested in finding the quickest possible answer in order to get rid of the press.
There are many things of importance, some more than others.
In 1972, Hynek told his experience at Project Blue Book and his investigations in the UFO experience. And later in 1977, he made a cameo in Steven Spielberg's cult classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You can see him right here. Hey, Dr. Hynek! Over in Britain, they also had their share of UFO reports, and that led the government to found the Flying Saucer Working Party in 1950. This 5-member committee concluded that out of the hundreds of cases investigated, only 3 were difficult to explain, although they eventually decided that they could have been optical effects and said that all the talk about UFOs was pure rubbish. It would be another 45 years before the follow-up study was undertaken, codenamed Project Condign, and which confirmed the previous findings, that the main causes of UFO reports were misidentification of man-made objects and natural phenomena. Yeah, how boring. With all this excitement, B-movies about Martians and such stuff were in full swing. From 1951, we have The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Man from Planet X, and The Thing from Another World, which was the first version of the famous The Thing, remade several years later by John Carpenter. One of our favorite films on the channel, by the way. From 1953, we can highlight the first film adaptation of The War of the Worlds, which Spielberg would try his hand almost half a century later. The First Invaders of Mars is also from that year. Sometime later, in the second half of the 1950s, among many others, we can point to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Earth vs. Flying Saucers, Forbidden Planet, It, The Terror from Beyond Space, The Blob, and Plan 9 from Outer Space, a little gem from crappy B cinema. All of these contributed to expand the American collective imagination regarding the Cold War all over the world, including the myths about UFOs and extraterrestrials. In fact, UFO sighting reports began to pop up all over the planet.
How many people have you told?
To be clear, many of those reports were real. People did see things, even if they didn't know what those things were. However, there was also a lot of made-up crap, with some folks saying that they had been contacted by extraterrestrials in order to gain popularity. Since back then, all these testimonies were immediately picked up by the press and TV, as there were always plenty of fanatics wanting to hear more about UFO cases. And of course, the weirder, the better. Add to this the usual cadre of fraudsters, attention seekers desperate for the 15 minutes of fame, and straight-up mental cases, and we have the perfect cocktail for UFO reports appearing left, right and center. Among such reports, we have the case of George Adamski, a Polish immigrant who ran a restaurant in California. For starters, he swore that he had seen multiple cigar-shaped UFOs since the late 1940s. But the main event came in 1952, when Adamski said that while driving through the desert, he was contacted by tall blonde humanoids. This kind of aliens are known as Nordics, Venusians or Pleiadians, because they supposedly come from the Pleiades, and they are thought to be peaceful and deeply concerned with human affairs following the first atomic detonations. Some even believe that they signed a peace treaty with President Eisenhower in 1955. And well, we must admit that the White House certainly attracts plenty of weirdos. Back to Adamski, he said that he communicated telepathically with an alien named Orphan and was invited to board a spaceship to go on a tour of several planets in our solar system. Following his experience, Adamski published various books like Flying Saucers Have Landed, which became a bestseller at the time. In them, Adamski included supposed photographs of UFOs, although many of them appear to be complete fabrications, like the top part of the surgical lamp and stuff like that. But one way or another, this prototype of UFO became ingrained in popular culture. Around that time, an air mechanic named George Van Tassel held a UFO-themed gathering in his aerodrome in California. This was the Giant Rock Spaceship Convention held in the Mojave Desert, which soon became an annual event. At these conventions, UFO fans exchanged their ideas on aliens and the impending new age. It turns out that Tassel was a huge enthusiast of the esoteric world who lived next to a giant rock with his meditation group. He recounted that one day an alien taught him how to rejuvenate by constructing the Integratron, a structure that could extend human life. Unfortunately, he died before he could complete it.
Can you appreciate the irony?
Meanwhile, all throughout the 1950s, the US government continued running multiple projects to develop super advanced aircraft, many of which were shaped just like flying saucers. The best known case is the Avro car, built in 1953. This circular jet aircraft, which probably inspired the Jetsons vehicle, didn't quite work as planned. The story goes that the blueprints from this thing were stolen from Nazi engineers at a farm in Prague. And then of course we have to consider that some images of these experimental machines were altered, like this one, which has been reproduced everywhere. As was mentioned before, there were several attempts to improve on the designs created by the Horton brothers for a flying wing aircraft. The most notable were the Northrop YB-35 and the Northrop YB-49, which were tested in the late 1940s, but various technical problems led the production to be cancelled. Supersonic flying wing designs were then set aside for a while, until the 80s, when some engineers realized that the features were ideal to avoid radar dissection. This led to the development of the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. And it's also worth mentioning that one of the Horton brothers, who had sought refuge in Argentina, developed jet fighters for that government, such as the IAE-37 flying wing. As we said, throughout the 50s there were innumerable cases of UFO reports, so we won't go into every single one of them. For example, we have the Lubbock lights in Texas, which featured some unusual light formation seen by many people. This incident was explained as being caused by a migrating flock of plover birds, which reflected the lights of some recently installed vapor streetlights. This doesn't make complete sense, and so many people believe that it was all the government trying to cover up a test flight of some secret aircraft. Another case was the Mariana UFO incident in August 1950, which took place in Great Falls, Montana. One day, Nick Mariana, manager of a baseball team, saw a group of flying objects and recorded the behavior on a 16mm camera which he carried in his car. This was later confiscated by the army, who erased most of his recording, explaining that what he had seen was really a reflection of two F-94 fighter planes. One of the most curious incidents was the Flatwoods Monster. This happened in West Virginia in 1952, when one night several people from Braxton County saw a shiny object traverse the sky and land at a local farm. A group of them went over to see what the heck was going on, and when they arrived, their flashlights revealed a tall, monstrous figure with a pointy red face and claw-like extremities. They all fled immediately, and the creature was never seen again. Subsequent investigations concluded that the light had been produced by a meteor entering the atmosphere, and that supposed alien was probably an owl sitting in a tree. From 1953, we have the Kinross incident. In this case, a US Air Force pilot named Felix Moncla chased the UFO he had located on his radar until they both disappeared suddenly and mysteriously over Lake Superior. The explanation given in this case was that the UFO was a plane from the Canadian Air Force, but the Canadians denied this. The prevailing theory is that Moncla's plane crashed into Lake Superior, but all we know for sure is that he was never found. A similar case to Flatwoods took place in the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter at a farm in Kentucky in August 1955. That night, 7 adults and 3 children from the same family said that they had photo of a bunch of small aliens who had sieged their home. The grown-ups had shot at these beings when they appeared suddenly looking through their windows. The creatures were described as small, with pointy ears and clawed hands, and with very shiny yellow eyes. Apparently, some media outlets reported the small aliens as being green, and that led to the explosive popularity of the little green men. By the way, the explanation given for this event was the presence of curious horned owls, combined with a little dose of collective hysteria, and perhaps a large one of homemade liquor. And by the way, this event is thought to have inspired the movie Critters. And now we're going to wrap up with what is considered the first alien abduction in history, or at least the first documented case. Unexpectedly, this didn't happen in the USA, but in Brazil, and this is the case of Antonio Vilas Boas. On the night of the 16th of October 1957, this 23-year-old farmer was minding his own business on his field at Minas Gerais when all of a sudden a UFO landed next to him. From it descended a group of aliens wearing spacesuits with big blue eyes and measuring around 1.5 meters. That's 5 feet for the metrically challenged. The aliens seized Antonio and dragged him into their spaceship, where they conducted strange experiments on him. Next, a very beautiful and very naked female alien proceeded to sexually use and abuse him. And finally, once the ETs had satisfied their curiosity and lust, they left him back at his farm and departed. According to the most commonly accepted theory, Antonio spent a night at a brothel, receiving a good old-fashioned SM. Perhaps not quite as exciting, but then again, life rarely is.
How disappointing.
And that is pretty much it for today. In the next episode, we'll learn more about alien abductions, and we'll also make a careful approach to the uber-famous Area 51 and all its mysteries.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.